I'm seeing lots of people pop into the room. So thank you everyone for attending this afternoon, if you're on Eastern time, session for Dismantle Preservation Unconference. This is the second year that this unconference has been hosted, and the intention of this event is to elevate historically excluded narratives, but also to amplify lesser heard voices and individuals who may have not gotten opportunities to speak at preservation conferences in the past. This year, that has been a focus on highlighting work being done by students, emerging preservationists, and grassroots activists. And I'm very grateful to have you all here with us today. We're going to have 2 lightning talks followed by a Q&A. So feel free to throw in your questions into the chat or in the Q&A box as the presentations go on. And if you are so inspired, you can tweet your feels with hashtag Dismantle Preservation. We're going to start with Kyle Reardon, who is zooming in all the way from Guam. So I'm incredibly grateful he woke up early for us.
Okay. First off, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. And for everyone who's influenced and organized to make this happen, to all of this week's contributors. I'm so stoked to be a part of all this action. There's a lot being talked about. So let's see if I can get my screen to share. Okay. This, okay. And I believe we are ready to go. Half a day. And hello, everyone in from the global community. Thank you. I'd like to believe that we are all here because we are interested in taking on the challenges presented at the forefront of our various fields and societies. This is exactly why I felt the topic of decolonization would be so fitting for this conference. And it's what I've come to talk about in the context of preservation. My name is Kyle Reardon. I'm a 5th generation settler colonial descendant of mostly Irish and German ancestry. I was born and raised in an area around the city of Canton, Ohio, which currently occupies the traditional territories of the Kaskaskia, Erie, and Osage nations. I'm a PhD candidate at The Ohio State University in the obviously settler colonial city of Columbus, Ohio, which occupies the territories of traditional and historical tribes known as the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandotte, Delaware, and Potawatomi, and previously to the people of Fort Ancient, Hopewell, and Adena cultures, also known as the Earthworks Builders, as well as other tribal nations of the region. Today, although the past being what it is, individuals from a broad range of indigenous backgrounds call Ohio home. I'm zooming in today not from Ohio, but from Jigo, Guam in the Marianas Islands, known as Guahan, Itano y CHamoru, or land of the CHamoru. It is currently an occupied and unincorporated territory of the United States of America and has been for over 100 years, since the conclusion of the insular cases in 1901. There has been over 500 years of colonial impact laid on the small island of Guam, and colonialism remains a contentious reality in terms of its tentative results here. My dissertation research focuses on decolonization movement in Guam, which faces very particular challenges due to circumstances caused by hypermilitarization, settler colonialism, and westernization that's occurred throughout its history and continues to this day. I lead you with a short personal and historical preface because decolonization is a massive subject, of which the historical trajectory, conceptual details, theoretical underpinnings, and methodologies are complex and still evolving in many contexts. And I don't have time to discuss this all at length in this presentation, even in the context of Guam. But I personally feel it's helpful to familiarize ourselves with the land and our positionalities on that land, with other people, especially when they don't really know you well and yet are listening to you talk about a topic like decolonization. Because decolonization is much more than what I just said about it. As a field of inquiry, it is critically attuned, especially to concepts of race and law. Politically and economically, it is an imperative for equity. Emotionally and mentally, it can take you to super heavy spaces. The more I learn about decolonization, the more I see it seeping into every aspect of life, not just in ways that I will be talking about today. And so institutionally, culturally, and socially, I believe it will be an integral challenge for global humanity in the future. If you can't see my screen, the quote from Deloria, Foner, and Simta states that for tribal peoples, the purpose of knowledge is to live rightly, with care and reverence. Because of the inherent weight felt by all people of the land at this time, it's important to me to also continue to speak to the space of learning that we make in our lives with empathy, listening, humility, and honesty as we navigate knowledge, preservation, and its application today. As I practice in this forum with you all, I too am still learning what this means. And y'all, it's been beautiful lately, but damn has it been tough too. So again, thanks for showing up today. Naturally, I can't help but share resources, especially from indigenous folks, that can get you and myself to continue to dive deeper into the subject. So go ahead, screenshot away. I also want to invite you all after this presentation to share your decolonizing thoughts and resources with me so we can facilitate the dialogue of learning together. For me, this is one of the most relevant notions towards practicing allyship from our various positionalities in decolonization movement. History is not your fault, but it absolutely is your responsibility. Today, I would like to talk about a really impressive aspect of the decolonization movement here in Guam, one that applies essential components of decolonizing agendas, such as survival, recovery, development, and self-determination. The Guam Preservation Trust will be providing us with 5 case studies which exemplify this application. And along the way, we will be seeing some quotes from people who played a role in these projects. As an NGO with over 30 years of commitment to the mission of preserving and protecting Guam's historic sites, culture, and perspectives for the benefit of its people and future, the GPT has played an integral role in teaching people from Guam and around the world about what it means to be CHamoru. Not only that, but it has skillfully navigated the turbulent waters of project funding through educational formats, cooperative dynamics, and advocacy for its communities. Whether it be from orchestrating successful grassroots fundraising campaigns or negotiation with other larger institutional bodies, the GPT has dedicated their investments to an effort of building autonomy for themselves and the CHamoru. The first case I have to discuss is that of a Kongak Historiata, which is a recently developed education program that utilizes alternate teaching strategies which are oriented around place-based knowledge, history, and CHamoru culture. The GPT worked in conjunction with local and US national partners to fund a program where CHamoru teachers take on the responsibility of designing upwards of 20 different lesson plans that incorporate textbook chapters, songs, and choreographed dances, all in the CHamoru language. These lessons are designed for a K through 12 curriculum, with hopes that the teachings will transcend the classroom setting into homes and the lives of families here on Guam. Ikungak Historiata lays a foundation for an expansion into an indigenous-oriented educational system. And it utilizes the preservation of historic places to do so. Furthermore, it stands as a testament of CHamoru people's capacity to build, develop, and determine what an integrated education looks like, with their own cultural practices and land-based knowledge at the forefront. More details on this project will be presented at the Past Forward virtual conference hosted by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in November. Our second case is the story of Hinanauta, our journey, a narrative that was written by 4 young CHamoru scholars for the commemoration of the 500-year anniversary of Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation. They were tasked to write a cohesive narrative about the Spanish colonial period in Guam according to the CHamoru experience and conceptualization. By using terminology and perspectives from the CHamoru community, they were able to successfully write an alternate history to add to already existing canons. The GPT, who partnered with the Guam Museum, the CHamoru Language Commission, played a vital role in acquiring the funding for this project in order to devise an exhibit at the museum that bilingually tells the story alongside material, culture, and art of the period. Next, we have programs that have been directed towards increasing access to archaeological methods and practice for youth and residents of Guam. One example is the San Dioniso church ruins in Umatic, which was the subject of a joint academic research project with partners from universities in Spain and Hawaii. This project integrated a component for teaching students ages 14 to 19 about field methods and archival lab work. Most recently, the GPT organized and curated their own archaeological technician training program at their HQ in Hagåtña, which was a 4-week course with multiple guest lectures that covered a spectrum of topics and methods that are of concern specifically in cultural resource management, or Section 106 archaeology, which has continuously been a pertinent public issue in Guam with the increasing rise of multinational corporate development and US militarization. And they are set to run another tech course in Saipan this coming fall. I've heard talks of other editions of this technician program being run here in Guam. Building off educational programs for the youth and public here in Guam, since 2011, the GPT created and still sponsors the Guam History Day competition, which stages the winners to the National History Day competition at the University of Maryland. The competition is held island-wide for private, charter, and all public schools. They follow the format of the national competition, where there are 5 categories of creative media for a junior or middle school division and a senior or high school division to submit to, either as individuals or a group. Winners of the island-wide competition then go through various workshops hosted by the University of Guam to work with professionals and academics on island who specialize in the various subjects the kids are presenting about. Additionally, they are productively engaged with community members, oftentimes leading to the emergence of a previously undocumented narrative that is unique within the canons of history on the subject. The final case I want to present is the Flores home in historic village of Inalanhan, Guam. Vernacular architecture is architecture that was built by local people of a particular time in history. Carpenters of that time would have built a house that is at first functional with the land and how people live with that land, eventually generating a trend of aesthetic appeal. The GPT facilitates the preservation of these ideas and efforts that were practiced throughout history periods, preserving and reinforcing the integrity of that historic architecture, but adapting it with new environmental, technological, and personal circumstances. On the face of these projects, it's not explicitly decolonization. Through and through, it is CHamoru, a complex identity like our own, but it has an indigenous heritage, which is vibrantly organized. The Guam Preservation Trust facilitates institutional indigeneity in Guam through its actions in the fields of history, architecture, education, and heritage preservation. It's even headquartered at the Lujan House, a historic building and significant place for telling the story of CHamoru resilience through multiple eras of colonialism. Its achievements in capacity building are primary examples of preservation as decolonization because of the autonomy and space they give to CHamoru in that setting to teach each other how to teach. They carry on the work needed today in defining and living their own pedagogy. They are developing new ways to do heritage preservation and education simultaneously, the CHamoru way, epistemologically and ontologically. They aren't just preserving indigeneity, but building avenues for embodying it, simultaneously expanding their skill sets for preservation. They are engaged in the survival and recovery of the CHamoru through the reconstruction and rehabilitation of the places they live and the places they frequent. And they aren't just giving a voice for multiple generations of CHamoru. They work to maintain its evolution out of a knowledge that reveres their community and heritage, ultimately advocating for the self-determination of that voice. In terms of the many places where the United States and other historically and presently colonial powers still have political sovereignty, one of the important questions I think about while considering the direction that the practice of preservation is heading in is, it's not just about who we are preserving for, but about how we are to center and empower voices through actions and organization at various scales. I would argue that in the case for indigenous communities, the highest priority in many places is organizing for land back acquisitions, of which the GPT has played a role in numerous times, securing roughly $10 million worth of land easements and holdings for preservation and the CHamoru. There are inherent challenges to acquiring that land back, as with any resource funding for a project. First, the challenge exists between the colonial landholder and the indigenously rightful and likely displaced landholder. Past that negotiation, the challenge then exists for those who reacquire that land. How to properly care for and manage it, who to do that work with. These are complex decisions to make, and they can easily be co-opted for means of extractivism once again. The way we choose to organize and institutionalize in order to make that decision on preservation is what is of critical importance. The GPT, and indeed preservation as a field, provides us guidance. That process and outcome can serve as political and economic movement in a direction towards dual power with colonial and imperialistic entities. That, in terms of Marxist-Leninist theory, is what the GPT has achieved in many ways. Keeping in mind that the negotiations which occur between entities of dual power do not expressively result in total fulfillment of pursuits of one party over another, because there is some degree of compromise and cooperation in order for the institutions of both sides to continue to coexist. But maintaining and growing those institutions which act in solidarity with communities historically and variously impacted by colonialism is what bolsters decolonization at larger scales. It does so by pushing a reorganization of the authoritative web of institutions either directly or indirectly involved with preservation. This works towards restructuring and even legislating the power dynamics from the top down, which then trickles into the controls of project funding, research, design, and application. Internally, within the field of preservation, we have so much power already to curate. So I think it's time we really contemplate and attempt to use our preservation facilities, our skill sets, our curiosity, our networks, and our privileges as a form of decolonization, making place with the colonially impacted and in many cases oppressed communities that have had to struggle for space to speak their story throughout history. And that goes much further beyond solely indigenous communities. It comes with all sorts of reconceptualizations. And it starts with what we have to work with right now. As a field of study and enterprise, preservation can be structured decolonially, no matter where you are at in the world. This is something I want to learn more about with my dissertation research, as well as other ways in which decolonization is embodied and institutionalized. But the GPT has provided us with a few of its many examples of that. Simply view the results of their projects or look closer at its institutional dynamics, or just look at who is involved with their projects and how. It becomes clear how it takes much more than a good idea and a few token roles. It takes a public commitment. It takes facilitation for equity. And it takes an honest and inclusive look at our past. And with that, it could very well have larger scale ramifications in our greater globalized societies. Thank you, and Sizus Ma'ase Zan Saina Ma'ase.
Thank you so much, Kyle. The Guam Preservation Trust is doing wonderful work, but we are going to fast forward to the very recent past with Emily's presentation. Emily will be delving into 20th century building materials, specifically concrete, with us this afternoon.
All right, can you see that?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, Kyle. That was really excellent and very, very interesting. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming today. So I'm currently studying for my master's at the University of York, and I'm looking at the challenges of adapting concrete buildings to increased flooding due to the climate crisis. So a brief look just at the carbon cost specifically. The architecture, engineering, and construction sector is responsible for approximately 40% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And every year, over 6 billion square meters of buildings are constructed, which is equivalent to over 3,700 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And this will grow as our world's building stock is expected to double by 2060. And I want to briefly define two terms, embodied carbon and operational carbon. Embodied carbon is the carbon emissions of materials themselves, so the total CO2 emitted in producing those materials, including extraction, construction, and through to demolition. And operational carbon is the carbon used to heat and power a building. Operational energy can be impacted by occupant behavior and can be reduced over time through renewable energy sources, but embodied carbon cannot be recouped. Once those fossil fuels and materials have been used in construction, it cannot be changed. And the embodied carbon of materials alone make up 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 28% of the building sector's current output. And all of this has been made worse by our use of post-war concrete production. Modern concrete is the most abundant human-made material on Earth, and it's second only to water in terms of use. It's the most environmentally damaging as well. Concrete produces 8% of global CO2 emissions, meaning that if it was a nation, it would be only third after China and the US. 19th century industrialization and the development of technology allowed for the capture of fossil fuels that burned at hotter temperatures needed for that concrete production in its modern form, and that have led to this greenhouse gas emissions, largely through the production of firing limestone needed at a consistent temperature for cement. And developments in mill and bridge technology led for the steel engineering that required those two materials. And steel and cement have kind of a symbiotic relationship to resolve critical building flaws. Concrete works well in compression, but has weak tension, so it relies on steel reinforcement or rebar to compensate and limit cracking when it's expanding, whereas rebar, on the other hand, relies on the high pH level of concrete to form kind of a protective layer around the steel. But it's not really a matter of if, but when that rebar will eventually fail. The porosity of concrete is highly dependent on the relationship between water and cement used in that mixture. But even if it's designed and executed to a high level, environmental carbon dioxide will work its way into that concrete through the pores in a process called carbonation. And it's the first stage of that ultimate corrosion. And this is particularly challenging in historic concrete because it was built at a time typically on using ration steel and using potentially experimental mixtures of additives in that concrete mix. So it can be hard to find appropriate mixtures and alternatives in replacement. And this is an example, this picture here is an example of that initial stage of corrosion called carbonation. But all of these problems are exacerbated when you consider that one of the primary results of our climate crisis and our increased use of greenhouse gas emissions is sea level rise, increased river and groundwater flooding, and more frequent severe storm events. The National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration has currently projected that by 2100, even with the lowest possible CO2 emissions, the global average sea level rise would be at least 12 inches. But with our current CO2 emissions, it could be as high as 8 feet. And these climate impacts are, of course, not equitably distributed between nations, communities, and even buildings within cities. But just to give kind of an overview of the technical challenges, as with any porous building material, the freeze-thaw cycle, where water expands as it freezes and then contracts as it thaws, can damage concrete. And this is especially true in marine environments where there is salt content that exacerbates that process. But in the pore structure of concrete, which gives it that strength, it also makes it less breathable. And this is especially true once water has gotten into that under that surface layer, because it is particularly slow to dry out. And once it kind of starts that process of decay, it can deteriorate quite rapidly and hasten that initial process of corrosion. And this will all exacerbate existing maintenance problems by the climate crisis as these weather events become more common and impact areas that are not typically subjected to these kinds of issues and have not been properly weatherized. And of course, as the challenge of these weather events and just the material challenges, there will also, of course, be the increased emotional and human post-disaster recovery to ramifications as well. So beyond the technical challenges of adapting these buildings to increase flooding, there are, of course, just the human and heritage values that come into play when working with these historic sites. So these values will not look dramatically different to anyone who's worked with US guidance, but I just want to take a moment to briefly look at the Historic England guidance for listing buildings, which was updated in a 2008 guidance document called Conservation Principles, which emphasizes that buildings must have historic, evidential, aesthetic, and communal significance for listing. And the current state of repair is not supposed to impact listing decisions, yet the original fabric, loss of original fabric is grounds for consideration. And the building on the right is an ongoing case in the United Kingdom with the Derby City Assembly Rooms. The assembly rooms were constructed in the 1970s and used as a flexible public space, hosting concerts, festivals, and graduations. They closed in 2014 after a fire in an adjacent car park, which didn't damage the structure itself, but impacted the ventilation systems. And it's remained unused since it closed in 2014. Planning permission for refurbishment was granted in 2019, but was then pulled in favor of demolition instead, which was granted in May of 2021, excuse me. And a certificate of immunity from listing was granted on the grounds that it was not a coherent or high quality design. The council has not proposed a specific long-term plan for the site beyond saying that a similar structure to the one that is currently in place will be proposed for 40 years, and a temporary outdoor pop-up market will be put on site in the interim to ensure that the space doesn't become disused. Critically though, the Derby City Council declared a climate emergency in 2019. They didn't undertake a whole life carbon assessment for the building before proposing to demolish the existing structure to determine the full impact of the operational and embodied carbon. One was independently produced, however, and determined that to demolish and then replace the building with a similar structure, as the council has stated is their intention, would produce 11,500 tons of CO2, which is the equivalent of driving around the world 738 times. That project alone would be the equivalent of 37% of the council's annual total carbon emissions. So going back to these values in the conservation principles guidance of historic, evidential, aesthetic, and communal significance, how are we valuing 20th century architecture, expecting it to hold the same historic and evidential significance as a medieval site? How are we expecting it to have the same social responsibility for our communities and in these communal spaces? It's clear that these buildings are complex to construct and complex to maintain. Technically, in terms of their materials, environmentally, and how they respond to their surroundings, and within the heritage policy framework that we've created them, and expecting them to be as responsive to their environment and live up to the same values as we expect them to as any medieval structure or any other historic structure. But I think it is worth continuing to ask what we are valuing through the preservation industry's focus on material authenticity. It's very easy to write these buildings off as failures because we're seeing them at their initial stages of carbonation and corrosion. But when these processes of maintenance are ignored, of course, they will continue to fail. In any other area of conservation, this is when preventative maintenance would intervene, and yet we're jumping to demolish them and then replace them with buildings that are functionally the same and no more sustainable in terms of the whole life cycle assessment, and are frequently worse. And this map is from the IPCC, from the UN, and shows that even in terms of limiting the warming from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius, the amount that could be saved in terms of limiting the risks of heavy precipitation, significant runoff and flood hazard, and compounded risk is significantly reduced in a half a degree of warming. And in that half a degree of warming, mean sea level rise could be limited by 0.1 meter. And I realize that 0.1 meter does not sound like a huge amount of sea level rise to limit, but that 0.1 meter would limit 10.4 million people from being impacted by sea level rise globally. And so these incremental changes in our global temperature, which keep being impacted through the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere through this demolition, has exponential impacts in terms of lives impacted. And so I think it is it's critical to think of how we as preservation professionals can kind of think of that work in terms of climate justice globally. So I thank you very much.
Thanks, Emily. A wonderful food for thought, and how we need to be more proactive in figuring out how to preserve contemporary building materials so that they do not continue to exacerbate our climate crisis by tossing them into the landfill. Let's start with this question for Kyle, but I think it's, just a really important question for us to consider as a whole. And it's already popped up as a theme in a number of our sessions. Language has a value. I said historically excluded instead of underrepresented. So the question asked to Kyle is, you used a phrase to describe your relationship to the land where you were raised, colonial something. Can you, what was that phrase again, and how did you come to it?
So the phrase that I used was that I am a 5th generation settler colonial descendant of mostly Irish and German ancestry. There's some Hungarian mixed in there too, I guess. But I came to that sort of phrase because, well, when you listen to people talk about the topic of decolonization, land acknowledgement is something that is kind of a precursor to whatever they're saying. And for many people, it's important to acknowledge land and the relations to that land. And so being somebody who is not indigenous to a land, I'm not native to a land, it's one of those phrases that I have then to share with people, to tell them, and really what it is it's a statement of positionality. So yeah, that's.
Thank you, Kyle. And if anybody in the audience is wanting to explore land acknowledgements, please reach out directly to your tribal historic preservation office or a tribe who is associated with your area and ask how they do land acknowledgements. Highly recommend doing that. Emily, we have a question for you from Jean. What's more damaging, tossing the Derby assembly rooms into a landfill or the environmental cost of the new construction?
They looked at the total cost of both the demolition and construction of that new building, and it was about 3 times more environmentally damaging to demolish and rebuild than to refurbish the Derby assembly rooms. So they looked at the environmental cost of that, and it was I think it was 4 tons of carbon to refurbish and about 12,000 tons of carbon to completely demolish and rebuild. So I don't know if they looked at just demolishing and then not putting anything back on the site, but I think in terms of damaging, demolishing and then rebuilding was significantly more environmentally damaging than that refurbishment. And I think that was the frustration of many people that looked at it, that they thought the building was in perfectly fine condition to be refurbished and that hadn't been fully explored.
So we got another one for Emily. In my experience, historic preservation is left out of conversations in environmental policy education in the US, possibly from construction management as well. Should historic preservation programs work more closely with environmental conservation and construction management programs, or are there partnerships between the fields already going on that I'm not aware of? Question from Liz.
I think that is one of my frustrations as well. And I think I think that's an area certainly for future work. I think both environmental policy and as well just kind of the broader engineering and construction industry. I think there's a lot of work. Obviously, preservation is by nature working with buildings, and I think not having architects working and learning directly from preservation in school, and not having preservation, not having some of those courses kind of overlap. I think that there is a loss in that field, not having architecture students learn some of those best practices and kind of learning about the material impacts, and not learning about kind of when lime is necessarily an appropriate material or the benefits of it, because it is a historic material. So I do think that there is certainly an area for improvement there.
Wonderful. So we're a bit over time, but that's okay. I would love any final, hi, Joe from Guam Preservation Trust in the comments. Connect with Joe if you want to learn more about Guam. But yeah, we'll start with Kyle. What are your final thoughts? And then we'll move on to Emily.
So I'll just keep it short. I'm obviously very consumed by my dissertation topic right now, and there's a lot going on for me in that way. But I really just want to say thank you to the Guam Preservation Trust and to Joe, everybody that he's put me in contact with, because it's been a really fortunate opportunity and a privilege. The work that they do, they make it easy for me to do a project like this, because this is they do really hard and well thought out work. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. And all of us will need to plan a trip to Guam sooner than later to learn these tactics. Emily, what about you?
Yeah, I'd say I'm also working on a much smaller dissertation. But I think one of the things that I find very inspiring about a week like this week with Dismantle Preservation is it's very, like, it can be very frustrating being in school and kind of seeing all of these things that feel very big and a little impossible to change. Like, how do we get this, like the question that was asked about how do we get architecture and conservation to work more closely together, and in an academic setting that feels very hard. And then it's nice to kind of come to a week like this and see a whole new generation of people that are doing incredible research. So it's just very nice to see all of the good work that everyone is doing. So thank you very much for having that.
Happily agree. It can be very frustrating. So to those of you in the audience who are wanting to learn more about preserving the recent past, including a lot of concrete, tomorrow we're going to have a lightning talk from Cats of Brutalism. And if you're not familiar with that Instagram account, check it out. And there will also be a talk on advocating for skate parks, which skate parks are typically constructed primarily of concrete. And there will be a number of conversations on decolonization throughout the remainder of the event, and finding ways to better connect with community. On Friday, there will be a conversation specifically on healing-centered community planning, which I think could tie back nicely to Kyle's presentation on what the Guam Preservation Trust is up to. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to this afternoon's Dismantle Preservation Unconference session. We have one more round of lightning talks coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and those will both tackle how to interpret difficult histories. One talk is from the perspective of Germany, and the other is from work that's being done in Jamaica. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and see you soon. Have a great day.